I came to Halford in the autumn of my 24th year with a trunk that was mostly empty and a heart that was mostly closed. I had taken the teaching post because there was nothing left for me in the town I came from. Nothing but the church where I was supposed to have been married and the long road out of it that a man named Caleb Doss had taken without me. He had promised me everything a man can promise a woman under a porch light. He had said he would wait while he went west to set up a claim. He waited until the first hard frost. By spring, he had married a widow with 40 acres and a sawmill, and I had learned the one lesson I believed I would carry to my grave: that a man's word is a warm thing in summer and a thin thing in winter, and that no woman should ever build a life on it. So when I stepped down off that coach in Halford, gray-eyed and tired, I had already decided that I would teach other people's children, and that I would grow old alone, and that this was not a tragedy but simply the truth told plainly. The woman who took me in was named Della Reardon. She kept a clean white house at the edge of town with cottonwoods leaning over the porch, and she rented out her front room to whoever the school sent her. She was past 70 then, slight as a sparrow, with white hair pinned up neat and a pair of dark eyes that had not gone dull the way old eyes sometimes do. She moved slow, but she moved sure. The first night she fed me beef and biscuits and let me cry into my plate without saying a word about it. And I loved her a little for that, the way you love anyone who lets you be miserable in peace. It was a week before she asked me what had brought a young woman so far from home with a face like mine. And it was that night, at her kitchen table, with the lamp turned low and the rain coming soft on the roof, that I told her the whole sorry tale of Caleb Doss. I told her about the porch light and the promise and the widow and the sawmill. And when I was done, I wiped my eyes and I said the thing I had come to believe: no man, I told her, would wait 20 years for a woman. They don't have it in them. They say they will, but they don't. I expected her to agree with me. Old women have buried husbands and disappointments both, and I thought she would pat my hand and tell me I was wise beyond my years to have learned. It's so soon. Instead, she smiled. It was a small smile and a long way off, like she was looking at something behind me that I couldn't see. "One did," she said. She poured us both more coffee, though it was late, and she settled back in her chair and she told me. I am going to tell it the way she told it, because I have never forgotten a word of it, and because I think she meant for it to be passed on. When Della was a girl, Halford was barely a town at all, a store, a smithy, a church with no proper steeple, and a scatter of homesteads up and down the creek. Her father was the man who owned the mill, which in a place like that made him near enough a king. Cyrus Hewitt was his name, and he had built everything he had with his own 2 hands, and he had decided, the way such men do, that his only daughter would marry up and never down. He had plans for her. He had a man in mind, a merchant from the rail town 2 days east, a widower named Conrad Ashford, sober and solvent and 20 years her senior, the kind of match that turns a mill into a small empire. But Della was 17, and she had already given her heart away, and she had given it to about the poorest prospect in the whole valley. His name was Silas Reardon. He had come up from somewhere south with nothing but a saddle and a strong back, and he hired on wherever there was work, mending fence, breaking horses, cutting hay. He was quiet. He was not handsome the way the town girls counted handsome, but he had a way of looking at a person, she said, like there was nowhere else he would rather be looking. They met at a barn raising. He carried beams all day in the heat without complaint, and at the end of it, when the others were dancing, he came and sat beside her on the woodpile and did not say anything clever at all. And that was how she knew. For one summer they had it. They had the creek bank in the evenings and the church steps after service and a dozen stolen half hours where the whole world was just the 2 of them in a long gold light. He told her he meant to have a place of his own one day, real land, his name on the deed. She believed him. She would have followed him into a sod hut and called it a palace. Then her father found out. Cyrus Hewitt did not shout. That was the worst of it, she said. He did not shout. He simply sat her down and explained to her calmly, the way you explain a sum, that she would marry Conrad Ashford in the fall, that Silas Reardon would be run out of the valley if he so much as wrote her a letter, and that there was no power on earth, certainly not a hired man with a borrowed saddle, that could change a single part of it. She was 17. She had no money and no place to run to, and a father who held the whole town in the palm of his hand. She did what girls did in those days. She wept, and then she stopped weeping, and then she obeyed. The last time she saw Silas before the wedding, she met him at the creek to tell him goodbye. She told me she had rehearsed 100 cruel things to say, because she thought cruelty would be kinder, that if she could make him hate her, he could get on with his life. But when she saw his face, she couldn't do any of it. She just told him the truth, that she was to be married, that her father would ruin him, that he had to go and forget her and find a girl who was free to be found. And Silas listened to all of it, and then he said the things she would carry for the rest of her days. "I'll wait," he said. She told him not to be a fool. She told him a man can't live on waiting, that he'd be an old man before anything changed, that her husband was healthy and she'd likely outlive Silas herself. She said, and she laughed when she told me this part, but it was not a happy laugh. She said almost exactly what I had said to her that very night. "No man waits. Don't you dare waste your life on me. I am not worth a life." And Silas Reardon just looked at her with that look of his, like there was nowhere else he would rather be standing, even there, even then, and he said, "That's mine to decide." Then he was gone and she married Conrad Ashford in the cold, bright light of October, and she went east to live in his fine house with his fine furniture, and that, she had been sure, was the end of the story. It was not the end of the story, it was only the long middle of it, and the long middle was 20 years. Conrad Ashford was not a cruel man. She wanted me to understand that, because she said it would have been an easier tale if he had been. He was correct, and he was distant, and he was, in his way, kind. He never raised a hand to her, never raised his voice, gave her a household to run and money for her church and a measure of respect. But he did not love her, not the way a person needs loving, and she did not love him, and they both knew it. And so they lived side by side in a quiet that was civil and cold, like two people sharing a coach who have nothing to say. She bore him no children, which grieved her more than the loneliness did. The years went by the way years do in a house like that. Sundays and suppers and the slow turning of the seasons, and a woman watching her own face go from young to not young in the glass. And every so often she would hear his name. Silas Reardon had not left the valley after all. He had stayed. He had done exactly what he said he would do all those years before. He had gotten himself a piece of land, real land, his name on the deed, a hard quarter section up on the bench above the creek that everyone said wouldn't grow. Anything but rocks. He proved them wrong. Year by year he made it pay. He never married. The whole valley remarked on it, the way valleys do. The Reardon man still a bachelor, keeping to his place, civil to everyone and close to no one. The town decided he was just a solitary sort. Della knew better and she never said a word. She heard, over the years, the small things. That when the Petersons lost their barn to a fire, it was Silas who came in the night with a wagon of lumber and would not take $1 for it. That when the schoolteacher took sick, there was always a schoolteacher, she said, smiling at me. It was Silas who paid the doctor and let it be a mystery who had. That in the killing winter of the bad year, when half the valley nearly starved, he drove cattle down through the drifts to families that had nothing and asked for nothing back. He had become, without anyone quite deciding it, the man the valley leaned on. The quiet one at the edge of things who was always somehow there when the bottom fell out. And once, only once in all those 20 years, she came home to Halford to bury her father. Cyrus Hewitt died hard and old and was put in the ground on a gray day, and half the valley came, because he was the man who owned the mill. Silas came too. He stood at the back, hat in his hands. She had not seen him in 15 years by then. They were both gray at the temples. They did not speak. There was nothing to speak about that could be said over a grave with 100 people watching. But as the crowd broke up, he caught her eye for just one moment across all that distance, and he gave her the smallest nod, and it was that same look. 20 years had not worn it off him. Nowhere else I would rather be standing. She went back east to her husband's house, and she cried for 3 days. And she did not let herself know why. Conrad Ashford died in the spring of her 51st year. A fever took him in 9 days. She nursed him to the end, and she grieved him honestly, because you can grieve a man you never loved if you have spent 30 years beside him. And when the will was read and the affairs were settled, she found herself a widow of some means, 51 years old, gray, with a face the years had not been gentle with, alone in a big cold house in a town that was only ever his. She told me she looked at herself in the glass that summer, and made the same peace I thought I had made at 24. That part of my life is over. I had one summer of being loved a long time ago, and I will live on the memory of it, and I will not be foolish enough to want more. She decided to sell the house and come home to Halford, not for any hope, but because it was the only place that had ever been hers. She wanted to be buried where she was born. That was all she was thinking of, a place to grow old and a place to be buried. She came back to the valley in the fall, 20 years almost to the month from the day she had left it, and she had been in her father's old house barely a week, with the dust sheets not yet off the furniture, when there was a knock at the door. She opened it, and it was Silas Reardon. He was past 50 now, gray all through, weathered brown by 30 winters of work, a man who had built something out of rock with his own hands and never once asked the world to notice. He stood on her porch with his hat in his hands the way he had stood at her father's grave, and he did not say anything clever. He had never once in his life said anything clever to her. He just looked at her with that look, the only look he had ever had for her, and after a while he said, "I heard you were home." She told me she stood there in the doorway, a widow of 51 with gray in her hair and lines around her eyes, and she could not for the life of her understand what he was doing there. She said the cruelest thing she could think of, the same cruelty she had tried on him at the creek a lifetime ago, because she was afraid, because hope is a terrifying thing to a woman who has done without it for 20 years. "Silas," she said, "we're old. Whatever you're thinking of, that time is gone. No man waits 20 years for a woman. Not for a real woman, not for a gray and ordinary one. You only think you did. Go home." And Silas Reardon stood there on her porch, and he did not flinch, and he did not go. "I never married," he said, "because I was already spoke for. I planted that whole bench above the creek thinking you might see it someday. I built the house with a second window because a house needs morning light on both sides, and I always meant for you to be standing in it. I waited because I told you I would, and a man's word ought to mean the same in winter as it does in summer." He turned his hat once in his hands. "I'm not here to take anything from you, Della. I'm just here to say I'm still standing where I said I'd stand. That's all. That was always all." She married him that next spring. She was 52 and he was 55, and the whole valley came, and this time her father was in the ground and could not stop a thing. They had no grand wedding. They stood up in the little church with the steeple it finally had, and they were married by the same kind of October light she had once dreaded, and then Silas took her up to the house on the bench, the one he'd built with a window on both sides for the morning light, and that was where she had lived ever since. 20 years he waited, Della said to me in her kitchen with the rain on the roof. Then we had 20 more together. He passed on 4 years ago come March, and I would not trade the second 20 for 100 easy years with any other man living. Folks felt sorry for him all that time, you know, the lonesome Reardon man. They never understood he wasn't lonesome. He was just being patient. There's a difference, and most people never learn it. I sat there a long while and did not say anything. I was thinking of Caleb Doss and his thin promise, and I was ashamed of myself not for being hurt, but for being so quick to decide that what one weak man had done was the whole measure of what a man could do. Caleb didn't wait 1 season. I finally said, "And you tell me a man waited 20 years. "Caleb," she said gently, "wasn't waiting for you. He was waiting for whatever came easiest. There's a heap of men like that, and you're well rid of yours, child." She reached across the table and took my hand in both of her thin ones, and her grip was stronger than I expected. "But don't you go telling yourself there's no other kind, because there is. I lived with the other kind for 20 years up on that bench, and I am here to tell you he was real. I stayed in Halford 11 years, I want you to know that. I taught the valley's children, and in my second year I met a man, a quiet one, not handsome the way the picture papers count handsome. A man who fixed the schoolhouse roof in the rain and would not take $1 for it, and looked at me when he thought I wasn't watching, like there was nowhere else he would rather be looking. I almost sent him away. I had my speech already, the one about how no man waits, the one I was so proud of. But I thought of Della Reardon in her kitchen, and the small smile and the 2 words, and I let him stay. She came to my wedding. She was past 80 by then, slight as a sparrow, with those dark eyes that never went dull, and when it was over she took my hand the same way she had that first rainy night, and she said, "Now you know." And I did. I knew that the world is full of thin promises and easy men, and that it is the simplest thing in the world to grow bitter and call it wisdom. But I knew something else too, something an old woman taught me at a kitchen table with the lamp turned low. I had told her no man would wait 20 years for a woman. She smiled and she said one did, and she was right.